Okay, my name is Marilyn Bierling, and I was a Spanish professor at Calvin College. I'm retired now.
During a sabbatical, Marilyn interviewed 18 individuals who were involved with Cuba and the CRC in order to unearth the rich history of Cuba and the CRC Church.
But this was a sabbatical project to find out more about the history of Cuban immigration and refugees in the Christian Reformed Church. And it was mainly to find out, it was actually the first major project of the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee, which now is World Renew, and of diaconal ministries in the Christian Reformed Church, in the first domestic project. So it had a lot of influence on the future direction of the church as well. So I wanted to find out why the Christian Reformed Church was open to receiving these refugees for the first time they actually received a large group of refugees, and also why the Cubans, many of them, were open to the Christian Reformed Church and its ministries, and how this whole migration and resettlement program has influenced the Christian Reformed Church. Determining why, at that point in time, the Christian Reformed Church wanted to get involved in refugee work, and finding out what the reasons were why that was an opportune time. And it seems like it was a convergence of many different factors. But I think a lot of it was the history of immigration in the church of Dutch immigrants. So people were open to the idea of immigration. But also I think had a lot to do with the moment, the historical moment in the 60s, were an era of social justice issues, of rebellion by young people, of desire to integrate, of the Peace Corps being formed, idealism, and there was just a lot of openness to receiving people like this. And combined with the Christian desire for mercy and justice, I think it was just a very opportune time when this sudden need, great need, came that the Christian Reformed Church decided to pioneer this. And it was actually the first domestic program that the Christian Reformed Church did through the Christian Reformed World Relief Committee at that time. Also, at that point, you might remember the Cold War was in full swing. And of course, these refugees were coming from an island that had just been overtaken by communists and Fidel Castro. And so I think that was another reason why we felt the need to help at that time. Also, the Cubans who first came, the first wave of immigration, because there were several, but the ones who started coming in the early 1960s were basically people who were quite educated from the upper class or middle class, and they were probably easier to settle than some of the other refugees we've seen simply for that reason. And also, one other thing, at the very end of the 1950s, Cuba had been approved as a mission field. And so we had missionaries, just two, who had been to Cuba and had to leave. And because of that, especially the Grave Church here in Grand Rapids, I think that we already were very interested in Cuba at the time of the Cuban Revolution. So there were a lot of factors that led to the Christian Reformed Church accepting these refugees. And in interview after interview, they talked about the love and compassion shown by the church. They talked about meeting their physical needs in the time of greatest need, and the Christian Reformed Church was willing to meet their physical needs and was interested in their lives now, not just in the future. So that was a great draw. The Christian Reformed Church opened up a Good Samaritan Center in Miami, which distributed free food and clothing and medical care. It served over 25,000 refugees in total over a couple of years. And I think that's one of the main reasons why they were very interested in our church as well. Since a lot of people were fairly well educated, they also were interested in the theology and catechism. They often were very curious to learn about that, and they appreciated the communal activities that were planned for them. Like in Grand Rapids, they had meetings in people's homes, and it was like a new home. So those were some of the things that really led to accepting the help from the Christian Reformed Church, and many of them actually joining the Christian Reformed Church. Also, it was there were the missionaries who had been in Cuba were some of the first leaders, so they knew Cuban culture already, and leadership among the Cubans was developed very quickly. So there were Cuban pastors. Some of them had been pastors already in Cuba. So that sort of leadership really led to appreciation of the Christian Reformed Church. Yeah, I think the church was changed because for the first time, this is the first time they actually accepted and integrated to some extent a large cultural group that was different from the Dutch majority in the church at that time. So I think that was a phenomenal way in which the church was changed, so that the hegemony of the church at that time was challenged, and people were forced to open their minds to people of other cultures and other languages. The Cubans have been important to the Christian Reformed Church. My favorite Spanish professor at Calvin was a refugee who started working out as a janitor because she didn't know any English or very little. Ended up being the chair of the Spanish department at Calvin for a great amount of time. There have been others who served on synod, on committees for the church, so they have played an important part in the Christian Reformed Church.
We have the same opportunity now to show love and compassion. If you're wondering how you can be welcoming, check out our many refugee and immigration resources at the link in the description. We have resources to help continue your learning and continue the conversation, whether you're learning by yourself or with your congregation. We would love to come to your church and facilitate our interactive Church Between Borders series. Or if you want to help resettle refugees, you can also find refugee resettlement organizations in your community using RCUSA's interactive map linked in the description.